When the Zathari queen installed hidden cameras to watch over her paralyzed, dying triplets, she expected to witness their tragic, quiet end. Instead, the midnight footage revealed a lowly human janitor committing an act so shocking it defied every known law of extraterrestrial medicine and changed the fate of two species forever. The atmosphere inside the Xenopediatric Intensive Care Unit at the Geneva Orbital Medical Center was heavy enough to crush bone. The ward, a marvel of human and Zathari engineering, was currently a monument to failure. Inside the sterile, argon-filtered stasis chamber lay the three royal heirs of the Zathari Empire, victims of a cowardly biological terror attack. They were paralyzed, trapped in their own rapidly calcifying bodies, and slowly suffocating. Queen Vale, the towering, iridescent matriarch of the Zathari, stood before the reinforced glass of the stasis chamber. Her usually vibrant violet scales were dull, entirely devoid of their natural luminescence, a physiological marker of absolute despair. For 3 weeks, Earth's brightest minds had collaborated with Zathari high physicians to reverse the effects of the Xilian neurotoxin. Every advanced treatment, from quantum gene splicing to subatomic neurological rewiring, had failed completely. Dr. Richard Hayes, the chief of xenobiology, stood nervously a few paces behind the Queen. He was a man who had dedicated his life to bridging the biological gap between humanity and the stars. But right now, he just felt utterly useless. "Your Majesty," Dr. Hayes began, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid to break the agonizing silence. "We have exhausted the experimental neural pathway treatments. The toxin has completely crystallized their motor synapses. Their brain activity is intact, they are conscious, but they cannot move, and soon their autonomic respiratory functions will cease. I am profoundly sorry." Queen Vale did not turn around. Her 4 primary eyes remained fixated on her triplets, Prince Kale, Prince Zur, and Princess Lyra. They looked like exquisite, fragile statues, carved from pale jade. "They are awake in there, Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice a synthesized, melodic hum translating through her collarcom. "My children are awake, entombed within their own flesh, screaming in a silence you cannot hear." "We can administer a heavier sedative," Dr. Hayes offered grimly, "to ease their passing." "No," Vale commanded, her tone suddenly sharp. "We do not sedate the royal bloodline. If they are to pass into the great void, they will do so with their minds unclouded. But I will not leave them unobserved, not for a single microcycle." That afternoon, Queen Vale authorized the installation of high-resolution microspectroscopic cameras throughout the sterile ward. The cameras were calibrated to detect even the faintest biological anomalies, heat signatures, microscopic muscle tremors, and subdermal fluid shifts. The official human protocol deemed it an unnecessary breach of patient privacy, but Director Susan Mitchell, head of the orbital station, overruled the objections. "You did not say no to the grieving matriarch of the most powerful armada in the Orion Spur." Vale wanted the cameras so she could monitor her children from her diplomatic quarters, hoping against hope to see a twitch, a sigh, a sign that the universe was not entirely devoid of mercy. She spent hours staring at the feeds, watching the rhythmic, mechanical rise and fall of the artificial lung ventilators attached to her children's chests. But a hospital, even an orbital one, is an ecosystem. It requires maintenance. It requires the unseen hands that keep the gears turning. Enter Thomas Gallagher. Thomas was 58 years old, a retired structural welder from Chicago who had taken a job as a senior maintenance technician, a polite title for a janitor on the Geneva Orbital, because he wanted to spend his twilight years looking out at the stars. He was a broad-shouldered, quiet man with salt and pepper hair, permanent calluses on his hands, and a tragic past of his own. 20 years prior, he had lost his daughter to a degenerative spinal condition. He knew the smell of sterile wards, the hum of life support monitors, and the agonizing, slow march of watching a child fade away. Thomas was assigned the night shift in Sector 4, which included the exterior observation decks and the sanitation of the xenopediatric ICU's outer airlocks. He was rigorously vetted by Security Chief Sarah Jenkins, cleared to handle the specialized cleaning solvents required for Zathari biology, and explicitly ordered to remain practically invisible. You go in, you sterilize the equipment casings, you mop the floor with the anti-static solution, and you leave. Chief Jenkins had briefed him. Do not interact with the medical staff unless spoken to. Do not look directly at the royal family. And for God's sake, Thomas, do not touch the stasis pods. Understood, Chief, Thomas had replied mildly, adjusting his gray utility jumpsuit. For the first few days, Thomas was exactly that, a ghost. He would enter the ward at 0200 hours, when the medical staff was down to a skeleton crew, operating with quiet, methodical efficiency. He wiped down the biometric scanners. He ensured the floor grates were free of static dust that could interfere with the anti-gravity lifts. He was invisible to the brilliant doctors and the weeping queen. But Thomas was a man who observed things. He noticed the way Dr. Hayes rubbed his temples in defeat. He noticed the way the monitors displayed a sharp spike in the triplets' heart rates whenever the automated lights shifted a silent indicator of panic. More importantly, he noticed the coldness of it all. The Zathari were a stoic, highly intellectual species. Their medical care was clinical, precise, and entirely devoid of physical touch. Even Dr. Hayes and the human nurses had adopted this hyper-sterile approach, interacting with the triplets only through mechanical arms and laser scalpels. The paralyzed children were treated like broken machines waiting to be decommissioned. On the fourth night after the cameras were installed, Thomas entered the ward. It was 0315 hours. The lights were dimmed to a soft twilight blue to simulate the Zathari homeworld's night cycle. The room was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilators. Thomas finished mopping the observation deck and moved toward the central stasis chamber. He was supposed to wipe down the exterior glass and leave, but as he sprayed his cloth with the anti-static solvent, he paused. Prince Zaire, the smallest of the triplets, had his eyes open. The alien child's pupils, normally thin vertical slits, were dilated wide with raw, unadulterated terror. The medical monitors showed a massive spike in cortisol and adrenaline equivalents, but because the child couldn't move or cry out, the alarm thresholds weren't triggered. He was having a silent panic attack, trapped in a paralyzed shell. Thomas stood there, staring through the glass. The protocols echoed in his head. Do not touch the pods. Remain invisible. But Thomas Gallagher was a father first and a janitor second. He recognized the look in those eyes. It was the exact same look his daughter used to get when her muscles locked up in the middle of the night, terrified of the dark and her own unyielding body. With a heavy sigh, Thomas set his mop down. He checked the hallway. Empty. He keyed his access card, bypassing the outer sterile lock, and stepped into the primary containment zone. In her opulent diplomatic suite, Queen Vale sat perfectly still in the darkness, her four eyes fixed on the massive wall screen displaying the live feeds from the ICU. She had not slept in a week. Her mind was a fractured prism of grief and duty. Suddenly, her peripheral vision caught movement on camera 4. Vale leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. Someone had breached the inner containment zone. Her first instinct was panic. Another assassin? She reached for the emergency security comms on her desk, ready to summon Chief Jenkins and a squad of heavily armed guards. But her hand hovered over the button. The figure on the screen wasn't armed. It was the human maintenance worker, the older male with the graying fur on his head. Thomas. Vale watched, confused and suddenly furious. How dare this menial laborer enter the sacred space of the dying heirs? She prepared to sound the alarm, to have him thrown out the nearest airlock for his insolence. But then Thomas did something that made the Queen freeze entirely. Thomas didn't look at the machinery. He didn't look at the monitors. He pulled up a small, sterile stool, sat right next to Prince Zir's open pod, and leaned in close. On the camera's highly sensitive audio feed, Vale heard a low, rumbling sound. It took her a moment to realize the human was vibrating his vocal cords. He was humming. It was an old, slow Appalachian folk song, a deep baritone rumble that Thomas used to sing to his daughter. The sound was incredibly deep, rich, and steady. "Hush now, little one. The night is long," Thomas murmured softly between the humming, his voice carrying a heavy, soothing weight. "But the morning's gonna come. I know you're scared. I know it's tight in there, but you gotta breathe through it. Just breathe." Queen Vale stared, bewildered. The Zathari communicated primarily through high-frequency chittering and synthesized translating devices. Human music, especially low-frequency vocalization, was completely alien to them. Then Thomas reached out. Vale gasped, her claws digging into her desk. Physical contact without a sterilized mechanoid proxy was strictly forbidden. Thomas ignored the medical restraints. He placed his large, warm, calloused human hands directly onto Prince Zir's rigid, calcified chest plating. The Zathari doctors had treated the paralysis as a purely neurological blockade, using lasers and micropulses to try and break the chemical bonds of the toxin. But Thomas didn't know anything about quantum biology. He knew about muscle cramps, rigor, and the human need for grounding. He began to apply deep, rhythmic pressure. Using the heel of his hand, Thomas pressed into the joints of the alien child's exoskeleton, right where the carapace met the softer underlying tissue. He started massaging the unyielding mass, his hands moving in slow, heavy circular motions, working with the exact rhythm of his deep baritone humming. "That's it, buddy," Thomas whispered, putting his back into it, generating friction and heat. "Gotta work out the rust. Don't fight the stiffness. Let it melt. I got you." In the diplomatic suite, Queen Vale watched the telemetry data overlaying the camera feed. What she saw made her heart stutter. The Zathari neurotoxin worked by forming microcrystalline structures in the synaptic gaps, effectively freezing the nervous system. The advanced lasers of the doctors had been too precise, too sterile, trying to burn the crystals away molecule by molecule. But Thomas's deep baritone humming was creating a low-frequency sonic resonance, a physical vibration that traveled through the dense air of the chamber. Combined with the heavy kinetic friction of a deep tissue human massage, it was creating a localized, chaotic warming effect. The crystals weren't being burned. They were being shattered by acoustic resonance and melted by mammalian body heat. On the screen, Prince Zir's panic indicators plummeted. The erratic spikes of cortisol smoothed out. The boy's dilated pupils focused, locking on to the strange, warm human sitting beside him. Thomas kept humming, moving his hands down the paralyzed alien's arms, rubbing the joints, applying deep, firm pressure that no machine could replicate with such intuitive empathy. "There you go," Thomas said gently, smiling tiredly. "You're a tough kid, just a little locked up, that's all. Let the warmth in." Vale leaned so close to the screen her breath fogged the glass. She blinked her 4 eyes, convinced she was hallucinating from exhaustion. On camera 2, zoomed in on Prince Zir's right appendage. A miracle occurred. It was small, barely a fraction of an inch, but it was undeniable. Prince Zir's primary index claw twitched. Then it curled inward. The medical monitors, which had been flatlined for motor control for 3 weeks, suddenly erupted with a soft pinging sound. Synaptic activity was registering. The bioelectrical pathways were firing. Thomas didn't jump or act surprised. He just chuckled softly, a warm, rumbling sound, and gently squeezed the boy's hand. "Good job, kid. That's a start. Now, let's work on your sister." Queen Vale collapsed back into her chair, a choked, clicking sob escaping her throat. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached for her comms. "Dr. Hayes," Vale transmitted, her voice trembling with a terrifying mix of awe and authority. "Get to the ward. Now." "Majesty," Hayes replied groggily, clearly woken from sleep. Have they?" "Do not interrupt him," Vale commanded fiercely, tears streaming down her scaled face. "Whoever is in that room, whatever that human is doing, do not let your machines or your staff interrupt him. Just get down there and watch. Down in the ward, Thomas had moved on to Princess Lyra, unaware that his quiet, illicit act of human compassion had just been broadcast to the most powerful being in the sector, or that the primitive, uniquely human concept of kinetic empathy had just accomplished what trillions of credits in alien medical technology could not. He just kept humming his old song, rubbing warmth back into a cold universe, one paralyzed child at a time. The heavy, pressurized doors of the Xenopediatric ICU hissed open with violent speed. Security Chief Sarah Jenkins burst into the room, her hand resting instinctively on her stun baton, followed closely by a disheveled and breathless Dr. Richard Hayes. Thomas jumped, immediately pulling his hands back from Princess Lyra's pod. The deep, soothing hum died in his throat, replaced by the harsh, sterile silence of the ward. He stood up, wiping his hands nervously on his gray utility jumpsuit, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Gallagher, step away from the royal patient immediately," Chief Jenkins barked, her voice echoing off the metallic walls. "Hands where I can see them. You are in direct violation of Sector 4 quarantine protocols." I wasn't hurting them, Chief," Thomas said, raising his calloused hands, his voice tight with regret. He knew what this looked like. A rogue maintenance worker tampering with the galaxy's most important patients. She was stiffening up. I was just trying to ease the rigor. It's a localized friction technique. "Shut your mouth," Jenkins interrupted, stepping between Thomas and the pods, her posture rigid. "Dr. Hayes, assess the children. If there's even a microfluctuation in their vitals, I'm locking him in the orbital brig." Dr. Hayes practically sprinted to the central diagnostic console, his fingers flying across the holographic interfaces. He expected to see a catastrophic system failure, a lethal spike in heart rates, or worse. Instead, he stopped. He blinked, pushed his glasses up his nose, and stared at the readouts. He cleared the screen and ran the diagnostic again. This is impossible," Dr. Hayes whispered, his voice trembling. "What is it, Doctor?" Jenkins asked, her grip tightening on her baton. "Is the toxin spreading?" Before Hayes could answer, a shadow fell over the entrance. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Queen Vale ducked her massive, iridescent frame through the doorway. It was the first time she had physically entered the ward since the triplets were sealed inside. Her presence was overwhelming, a mixture of towering alien royalty and absolute maternal desperation. "Stand down, Chief Jenkins," Vale commanded, her synthesized voice booming through the chamber. "The human is not a threat." Jenkins immediately stepped back, bowing her head in deference. "Your Majesty, he breached quarantine. He was touching them with his bear." "I saw what he was doing," Vale interrupted, her 4 eyes fixing on Thomas. The janitor swallowed hard, bracing himself for an alien execution. Instead, the Queen turned to the chief of xenobiology. "Dr. Hayes, explain to me what I am seeing on these telemetry feeds." Dr. Hayes looked like a man who had just watched gravity reverse itself. He tapped a key, projecting a massive holographic model of Prince Zur's neural network into the center of the room. "Majesty," Hayes began, stammering slightly, "for 3 weeks, we've been using subatomic lasers to try and meticulously sever the crystalline bonds of the xylene neurotoxin. We treated it like a surgical extraction, but the toxin was too adaptive. Every time we cut a crystal, it reformed stronger. We were trying to pick a lock that was rusted shut." Hayes turned to look at Thomas, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound respect. "What Mr. Gallagher just did, he didn't pick the lock. He shattered the rust," Hayes explained, pointing to the glowing holographic brain. "Human vocal cords, especially a deep baritone, generate a very specific low-frequency acoustic resonance around 110 hertz. The Zethary auditory system doesn't process these frequencies naturally, and our medical machines are built for silent, high-frequency precision. But that low hum, combined with the mammalian body heat of 37 degrees Celsius from his hands and the heavy kinetic friction of a deep tissue massage." Hayes paused, letting the sheer absurdity and brilliance of it wash over the room. "The combination created a localized, chaotic thermal acoustic event," Hayes concluded. He literally vibrated the crystalline lattice of the toxin until it reached its shatter point, and then melted the residue with his body heat. The synaptic pathways aren't just opening, they are rapidly regenerating. Zir's motor control is already up 12%. Silence fell over the ICU. The realization of what had just occurred hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The most advanced medical science in the Orion Spur had been bested by a retired welder singing a lullaby and rubbing a child's shoulders. Queen Vale slowly approached Thomas. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, an apex predator of a matriarchal empire. Yet, as she looked down at the gray-haired human, her posture softened. "You are a custodian of the outer decks," Vale stated softly. "How did you know this would work?" Thomas lowered his hands, his shoulders slumping. He looked past the queen, his eyes resting on Princess Lyra's pod. "I didn't know anything about crystals or acoustics, Your Majesty. I just know what it looks like when a kid is terrified and trapped in their own body." Thomas took a shaky breath, the memories of 20 years ago surfacing, raw and unhealed. "My daughter, Abigail, she had a spinal disease," Thomas continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Her muscles would lock up in the middle of the night. The doctors had all their fancy machines, their sterile rooms, but when the pain got bad, the machines couldn't hold her hand. They couldn't tell her it was going to be okay. The only thing that stopped her crying was when I'd sit with her, rub warmth back into her legs, and hum that old song. It grounded her. It reminded her she wasn't alone in the dark." He looked back up at the alien queen, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I saw your boy's eyes, Majesty. He was alone in the dark. I couldn't just mop the floor and walk away. I'm sorry if I broke your rules." Queen Vale reached out. In Zathari culture, physical contact was reserved only for the most intimate of blood bonds. To touch an alien species was a profound breach of societal norms. But Vale didn't care. She placed her large, scaled hand gently over Thomas's calloused, trembling hand. "You did not break our rules, Thomas Gallagher," Veal hummed, her voice vibrating with immense gratitude. "You saved our future. Please, will you continue?" The following weeks at the Geneva Orbital Medical Center were unlike anything the galactic medical community had ever witnessed. Dr. Hayes and his team completely scrapped the high-tech, sterile protocols. In their place, they instituted what became officially known as somatic resonance therapy. In practice, it meant Thomas Gallagher was promoted from maintenance technician to the highest-ranking therapeutic specialist on the station. The Zathari, a species that had evolved past physical touch centuries ago, had to relearn the concept of warmth. They had become so advanced, so cleanly separated from the messy realities of biology, that they had forgotten the healing power of basic kinetic empathy. Every night, Thomas would enter the ward, but he no longer sneaked in. He was escorted by royal guards who bowed as he passed. He would spend hours with the triplets, systematically working through their paralyzed limbs with firm, warm massages, his deep baritone voice rumbling through the chamber with old earth folk songs, sea shanties, and blues. The political and cultural shock waves were massive. The Xylian terror cell that had engineered the toxin had designed it specifically to exploit Zathari culture. They knew the Zathari would never attempt chaotic physical intervention. They knew the royal physicians would rely solely on sterile, precise machinery. The Xylians had engineered a weapon that used Zathari stoicism against them. What the terrorists hadn't accounted for was humanity. They hadn't calculated the sheer, stubborn, messy compassion of a human father who refused to let a child suffer alone. By the end of the 4th week, the impossible became reality. Thomas was sitting beside Prince Zir's pod, humming softly as he worked the joints of the boy's right arm. Suddenly, the alien child's hand moved on its own. The primary index claw lifted, reaching out and weakly grasped Thomas's thumb. Thomas stopped humming. He looked down at the boy. Zir's vertical pupils dilated, focusing on the human. The paralysis in his jaw had finally shattered. 3 thumb as. The young prince clicked weakly, his vocal synthesizers straining to form the human name. It was the first word any of the triplets had spoken in 2 months. "I'm right here, buddy," Thomas smiled, a tear finally escaping his eye and rolling down his weathered cheek. "You're doing great. You're coming back." By the end of the second month, all 3 heirs were fully mobile. The crystalline toxin had been completely eradicated from their systems, quite literally sung and rubbed out of existence. The day the Zathari royal family departed the Geneva orbital, a grand ceremony was held on the station's primary observation deck. Dignitaries from a dozen star systems were in attendance, murmuring about the human miracle. Queen Vale stood before the massive viewport, her 3 children standing proudly beside her, their iridescent scales shining brightly once more. She summoned Thomas Gallagher to the front of the assembly. "The Zathari Empire owes a debt that cannot be quantified by credits or treaties," Queen Vale announced, her voice echoing across the deck. She presented Thomas with the Star of Zethar, the highest honor ever bestowed upon a non-Zethari. "You have shown our people that in our pursuit of absolute perfection, we forgot the fundamental warmth of existence. You are forever a friend of the crown." She offered him an estate on the Zethari homeworld, a fleet of personal cruisers, and a life of absolute luxury. Thomas looked at the glowing metal in his hand, then out at the endless expanse of stars beyond the observation glass. He thought of Abigail, and how proud she would be. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, I appreciate the offer," Thomas said politely, his deep voice carrying a quiet humility that stunned the alien dignitaries. "But I'm a Chicago man at heart, and I've finally got a corner office with a pretty good view here. Plus, Dr. Hayes tells me there are some other kids in the lower wards who could use a little help working out the stiffness." Queen Vale smiled a terrifying, beautiful showing of teeth and bowed her head. "Then the universe is safer in your hands, Dr. Gallagher." Thomas never accepted the title of doctor, but he did accept the new position. He spent the rest of his days on the Geneva orbital, the head of a brand new interspecies pediatric physical therapy wing. He proved to the galaxy that humanity's greatest strength wasn't our weapons, our starships, or our cunning. It was our enduring, warm, and messy humanity. It was the simple, profound ability to reach out into the cold dark of the universe, take someone's hand, and tell them they were not alone. Did Thomas's incredible act of human compassion move you? The greatest miracles often come not from advanced technology, but from a simple touch and a father's love. If you enjoyed this thrilling sci-fi story of humanity, healing, and defying the odds, please hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from across the universe. We will see you next time.